The late Kofi Annan, who served as the 7th Secretary General of the United Nations, once said, "Extreme poverty anywhere is a threat to human security everywhere." Until date, those words continue to prove its truth in our current dispensation. From time immemorial, the world has battled with the situation of poverty in many regions all over the world. Currently speaking, approximately 800 million people are living in extreme poverty, which is basically surviving under $1.9 a day or even less. Unfortunately, a whopping 80% of that number live in rural areas. Many have the perception of poverty being just the inability to afford basic needs in life, such as food and shelter, which of course it is, yet it is so much more than that. According to the World Bank Organization, poverty is hunger, poverty is lack of shelter, poverty is being sick and not being able to see a doctor. Poverty is not having access to school and not knowing how to read. Poverty is not having a job. Poverty is so much more than meets the eye, and with about 800 million people going through it every day, it is more than vital that action be taken now rather than later. It is a known fact that children and young people make up a majority of the population in rural areas, meaning they suffer more of the effects of poverty than any other age group. However, there has been drastic decrease in the population of the world living in extreme poverty, in the sense that around 350 million people living in rural areas were elevated from poverty in the last decade, as reported by the International Fund for Agricultural Development, also known as the IFAD, which is a United Nations agency. Despite this achievement, a massive amount of work is still needed to be done to completely eradicate poverty, especially in rural areas whereby the main causes of poverty can be pinpointed back to the lack of education in those secluded areas, lack of infrastructure, and to recurring conflict, which is becoming an increasingly involved reason in the past few years. Many believe that poverty as a whole cannot be fully distinguished. Nevertheless, in this conference, the main focus will be to reduce its effects on people living in rural areas in order to make sure that even if these people in poverty don't have all the needs one should have provided in a household, they have enough to live a comfortable life. Poverty often presents itself in a variety of ways pertaining to the different environments and situations it occurs in. This is one reason why poverty is often labeled as a complicated social phenomenon. Poverty in all forms differs between countries. To many living in rural areas, it is a never-ending cycle generating from the lack of education, leading to higher birth rates from misconduct amongst the youth. Conditions in these areas are unable to sustain these children, therefore they suffer from diseases, and due to their poor health and well-being, they are unable to go to school. There are indeed many more factors that go into contributing to rural poverty, which on a positive note points out where help, aid, and action can begin to minimize rural poverty worldwide. Education, without most realizing it, is in fact a key factor to not only reduce rural poverty, but poverty as a whole. Many families who can't afford to take their children to school opt for them to work in order to make enough wages to sustain the family for the next day. Not only does this deprive the child from their own basic rights, but prevents them from accessing a secure future whereby their learned knowledge and skills from school could be used to earn them well-paying jobs that could sustain the family for years to come. Some families still do not believe in taking their female children to school, as the conviction they have to keep them at home to do work overshadows the advantages of taking their girls to school. It has in fact been quoted by the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, that 171 million people could be lifted out of poverty if they left school with basic skills, and if there had been more knowledge acquired, poverty could be cut down by half in the world. It is widely known that people who live in rural areas work in the agricultural sector to make whatever wage they possibly can. With climate change, there are new weather phenomena, meaning more and more droughts and floods are occurring, and as a result of the changes in weather, agricultural yield is very low, eliminating people in rural areas from their main and possibly only source of income. As a result, these citizens plunge deeper and deeper into abject poverty. The World Bank estimated that climate change could drag 100 million more people into poverty over the next 10 years, which could completely hinder the improvements made to decrease poverty in the world. Infrastructure in this case wouldn't relate to just buildings or shelters to live in, but also roads for transport, internet to be continuously updated on what's happening in the world, cables for light, and so on. All of these examples listed are not accessible to those living in rural areas, and therefore it puts them in a situation whereby they are cut off from keeping up with modern terms and living standards of the world today. Without roads, for example, transportation is very difficult as these civilians have to walk distances to get to a destination for basic services they need, such as medical care. The latter option would be to pay for transport services, but those are unaffordable, especially for people living in abject poverty. Being cut off from the world also has its negatives, whereby people living in the rural areas have limited opportunities to not only grow but develop, which in the end can be added as one more thing to the list of why rural areas continue to remain in poverty. About 192 million people worldwide are unemployed, and as one can foretell, a large percentage of people living in poverty are included in that number. Without jobs, people living in rural areas are not able to earn a wage to provide for their basic needs. Hence, they turn to their option, which is to involve crime. This could be a particular reason as to why crime rates are especially high in rural areas. Criminal activities are performed mostly by the youth ranging from 15 to 24 years. Once again, without these teenagers and young people going to school, they involve themselves in such activities, which proves time and again why it is vital that school be a necessity for the young population in rural areas in order to reduce poverty.